Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me in this session. Today we will be discussing vocational education and the phenomenon of academic drift. This is part one of two sessions in which I will explore the subject of ethnic attainment in higher education. In this session I will simply focus on the phenomenon of academic drift, and in part two, academic drift will be used as an analytical framework in order to make sense of the ethnic attainment disparity in higher education. To present my argument, I have divided this session into three parts. I will begin by defining academic drift and then moving on to the discussion of theory, which will provide the interpretive lens by which we can make sense of part 3, which will be a socio-historical analysis of Britain's vocational higher education sector. I have decided to focus on higher education as it is the primary area in which academic drift is studied. So what is academic drift? Academic drift has been defined in many ways. In essence, academic drift is the gradual evolution of vocational education system towards traditional academic practice. Vocational systems can include institutions, programs, staff, the student body, and so on. This evolution is driven by the desire to achieve esteem or prestige, which is generally granted to elite universities. Now, in the English context, this can be seen in three stages of higher education expansion. In mid to late 19th century, most of the prominent medical schools in London, as well as leading technical colleges elsewhere in the country, gradually sought university status and became what are now civic or red brick universities. We saw the same thing happen with the colleges of advanced technology, or CATs, which became universities from 1962 to 1964, and then with the university status given to the polytechnics in 1992. In all three stages, you observe the evolution of vocational or professional institutes and colleges towards traditional university attributes and practices. I will be providing more detail on how this happened and its impact in part 3. So here we have Kaivik's typology, which is a further development on how we can understand various levels of drift. I won't discuss all of the different forms here, but I just want to emphasize on two categories. Firstly, program drift, which is when vocational programs transition from being teaching intensive and practical with lots of student-teacher contact to becoming more research intensive and theoretical, adapting a more progressive pedagogy. The use of academic or traditional learning practices have the greatest impact on students who neither have the prerequisite skills to engage with advanced academia nor the desire to participate in academia. Now, program drift is nearly always instigated by a form of staff drift. Staff drift is where faculty staff seek to conduct more research and teach theory, which in turn reduces the teaching commitments and incentivizes the use of traditional university pedagogy. So now that you know what academic drift is, I am now going to explain how and why it happens. As with all phenomena, there are various ways in which we can interpret them, subject to the theoretical lens applied for analysis. For our discussion today, I will be using Bourdieu's theory of cultural conflict. I will not go into too much detail about Bourdieu because much can be said about his framework, and as with most theoretical frameworks, they are great in helping us make sense of the social world, but they can also create blind spots and embody biases and limit our ability to make sense of any given phenomena. So who is Bourdieu? Pierre Bourdieu was a prominent social scientist of the postmodern era. His ideas can best be described as a form of cultural or neo-Marxism. Cultural Marxism accepts that society is divided based on economic position. However, real oppression and inequality is less about monetary gain and loss and more about cultural engagement and interaction, where the members of the more privileged social class will seek to to undermine the cultural value of those who are less privileged. Bourdieu fundamentally deals with conflicts of status amongst socially stratified groups. Bourdieu's theory rests upon the notion that individuals inherit cultural practices subject to their class position, which allows them to gain or lose status within socially defined fields. So as an example, say you came from a wealthy background, you will inherit various practices as a result of your class position, such as language, accents, access to education. You will have particular tastes in food, in leisure, art, and so on. Now, when you engage with others, given these embodied practices and tastes, you enter, as Bourdieu calls, into duels of honor, competing with others to showcase your cultural distinction. The group or individual occupying the inferior social position is judged by those who are socially privileged and as a result hold culturally dominant positions. If there is any lapse in showcasing culturally aligned practices, legitimacy as an established member of the social field is questioned and scrutinized by the dominant group. A good example of this is a student from working class background being accepted to an elite university. When he engages with a professor of literature, for example, there is a cultural battle where the formally speaking English professor will question the legitimacy of this working class student in being part of the elite university. The cultural value of the working class student will be undermined, which may go on to exclude him and impact his performance. Given Bourdieu's theory, this is also the case when the professor in literature engages with other professors. Though both may stem from the same social class and have similar educational backgrounds, according to Bourdieu, they are both in a conflict to see who has cultural distinction, who's more learned than the other, who has published more journal articles and books, and who has had the greatest impact in the field. Now, in addition to this cultural conflict that people engage in, the drive to maintain cultural distinction is further conflicted by the necessity of showcasing valued cultural practice. Simply speaking, you must show off your cultural attributes for them to acquire value. Bourdieu argues that this is done with efficacy if the individual is successful in convincing others of his or her sincerity and in averting any suspicion of being politically motivated. Consequently, agents that hold positions of distinction within a field will display their elite status through symbols such as language, bodily characteristics, leisure, art, and so on. Bourdieu defined this display of abstract distinction as symbolic violence imposed upon those who are perceived to embody lower valued cultural practices. If we go back to the example of the working class student attending an elite university and engaging with a professor, according to Bourdieu, the professor will never tell the student that he does not belong. Rather, this is done in a very subtle way. If the professor overtly tells the student that he doesn't belong, his political motive becomes obvious. The only way you can show your cultural dominance is to use class-centric cultural references during various forms of engagement. Now, within a university, this can happen in lectures. It can happen by adopting more academic form of assessment like essay-based exams and so on. This way, the student must overcome cultural barriers in order to feel that they belong in that particular university. Now, in order to codify his theories, Bourdieu developed 3 models, but for the sake of our lecture today, we will only focus on 2. The first is the belief that the social world is divided into social fields or arenas, places where the struggle for cultural The second model that Bourdieu formulates is cultural capital. Cultural capital is cultural competence that is aligned with the field, and because it is a form of capital, as in value that is acquired, maintained, and invested, individuals can gain and lose cultural capital, and some cultural capital is more valued than others. So the example of the working class student in an elite university, he has lower valued cultural capital, his practices are not aligned with the field, whereas the professor of English or literature has higher capital in relation to the student, but equal or less cultural capital in relation to, say, the dean, who probably has more publications and occupies a prominent position in the faculty. Bourdieu demarcates three different forms in which cultural capital can manifest. So you have embodied cultural capital, which are things like language, accents, deeply rooted perceptions. If you are familiar with Bourdieu's theory, embodied cultural capital is synonymous with the notion of habitus. Embodied cultural capital can also imply one's primary socialization. Secondly, cultural capital can be objectified in the objects you own, such as a house, cars, clothes, etc. If you have a house in an uptown neighborhood and drive a Ferrari, for example, you have higher objectified cultural capital. You can also have institutionalized cultural capital, which is the third form of cultural capital. Institutionalized cultural capital is acquired by being associated with particular institutions. For Bourdieu, this was primarily the cultural capital acquired by attending an elite school or university. You can also ascribe it to, say, working for a major corporation like Apple or Google. That association brings with it cultural capital. It shows that you are part of an elite institution. So we have discussed the definition of academic drift, which is the gradual evolution of vocational systems towards traditional university practices as a way of gaining esteem or prestige. As a way of explaining this, I have presented Bourdieu's social theory, which understands human behavior to be driven by the desire to achieve esteem or cultural capital. And the worth of cultural capital is based on the status of the field, how much a person or individual embodies that field, and how they enact that field when they engage with others. Now, for part 3, we are going to bring these two aspects together and look at how academic drift actually occurred within the English vocational higher education sector. So let's start with the field of English higher education. Now, to be clear, this is a very brief overview of the English higher education sector, as much can be said about its history and how it has evolved. I will only focus on a few aspects of the field in order to create a narrative. The idea is to understand the culture of the field and the characteristics of valued practice within it. So, prior to the early parts of the 19th century, the field of English higher education was dominated by two institutions, the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge. And this had been the case for over 600 years. For most of their history, the individuals that participated in these two institutions were from the governing classes, the aristocracy and the landed gentry. From these 2 points alone, we can argue that the field of English higher education was an elite field. It was socially exclusive, and it is where the leaders of English society went for their education, which means these two institutions and their culture had a major influence on English society. The field of English higher education was also highly autonomous. Protected by royal charters, Oxbridge made their own rules. They decided what they were going to teach, who they were going to accept as students, and so on. Going back to the theory, the autonomous nature of the field meant that there was less external influence, and the hierarchy of valued practice was sophisticated. In other words, for one to participate in English higher education, you must embody very particular characteristics of language, manner, what to wear, and how to interact with others. I would go as far as to say that the field of English higher education was the most powerful field in English society, because it defined what was proper culture. More importantly, Oxbridge trained the clergymen who would lead the various parishes around the country. Oxbridge culture was then also the interpretive authority on religious scripture. It defined what was moral. So from that we have an idea of how prestigious the field of English higher education was. But what were the valued practices within the field? One of the ways you can identify valued practice is to study the education philosophy adopted by Oxbridge. According to Martin McLean, the British elite education, at least up until the 19th century, was based on a humanist understanding of education. The primary goal of humanist education was to cultivate within the hereditary elite a deep understanding of morality, namely Christian ethics. It was to cultivate the gentleman scholar who would be able to apply the principles of moral philosophy in any given situation. Martin McLean argues that the dominance of the humanist tradition in Britain was due to Britain's imperialist motives. The archetype of the humanist education was, as he says, the colonial district officer taking charge of a vast area with subjects whose customs and social institutions he barely understood. And this is key. The Oxbridge graduate was someone who was able to make informed decisions in any given situation. Now, to systematize this tradition, the curriculum at Oxbridge consisted of history, literature, philosophy, namely the study of classics, all of which would allow the students to examine moral choices. Oxbridge also taught mathematics, which was seen to develop within the individual the skills of abstraction and logic. According to Martin McLean, the decline of classics and the rise of mathematics and science was a late 19th century development. Before I move on, I just want to add that Oxbridge universities were the only two institutions that awarded a degree qualification. A student gained a degree if they had shown competent understanding of the classics and mathematics. Oxbridge examinations were not as high stake as they are now. A 2:2 degree, for example, was called a gentleman's degree because it meant that you were not too academic and that you took part in extracurricular activities. So if Oxbridge are very selective and only a handful of privileged males attend, what is everyone else doing? As you already may be aware, compulsory education for the masses, free at the point of delivery, is a relatively recent development in the history of education, which means up until the early parts of the 20th century, you would be trained from a young age in some kind of craft, most likely a family business. Now, the training was defined as being on the job. Later commentators defined it as the apprenticeship model, the occupational model, and you also have the notion of the workshop model, which is mainly ascribed to engineers. Richard Sennett, in his book The Craftsman, makes a good point about the ethos of craftwork, which he defined as the act of actively searching for problems and then seeking solutions, which made craftwork highly specialized. The apprenticeship model is understood to develop high levels of practical expertise. English engineers, for example, were reputed for having excellent practical expertise. Now, linking back to theory, all craft-based occupations were within their own fields. The practice of searching and finding solutions to occupational problems made these fields highly specialized. In terms of esteem, however, the status of these fields was certainly less than the universities. And this is for various reasons. Again, applying theory here, what we understand is that the vocational fields were established and participated in by the less privileged groups in society. They exerted less influence overall, and they were less autonomous in the sense that the field was highly susceptible to the changes in the economy and any form of technological development. A good contemporary example of this is the notion of disruptive technologies, which can make certain job functions and entire professions obsolete. Now, all this changes with the Industrial Revolution. Now, before I develop on that, I do want to emphasize on this quote by Anderson, who has written extensively about the history of technical education, and he argues that those individuals within these vocational fields were very different from those in the universities. They were from a different class, had a different ethos, and were even from different denominations. Not surprisingly then, they considered university education irrelevant. As with most structures of society, the Industrial Revolution changed many of the field dynamics. The engineering and chemistry fields, for example, were able to exert substantial influence on the rest of society because they had, in a sense, given birth to the Industrial Revolution. But with regards to the university field, it was the second Industrial Revolution that brought about great change. Robert Locke's study on the relations between industry and education provides really good examples of how the two sectors interacted in their formative days. Developments in dyes, pharmaceutical and engineering meant that individuals within those sectors need theoretical training, especially in subjects like mathematics and physics, which were in the domain of the universities. Now, the apprenticeship model that was in place was considered effective for practical training, but in order to innovate and be competitive, theory was also needed. Many historians discuss the reluctance of British engineers to change their apprenticeship model of training. The reason for that was engineers felt that they had given rise to the Industrial Revolution and were maintaining it. The workshop model was the best way to train future engineers. At this stage, engineering as a field was experiencing its own golden age. So the general idea was that we need individuals to know advanced science and be practical in order to adapt to the changing industrial climate. But why universities? Why not open new specialist colleges and teach theory and conduct research? Why enter the university field? Two influences were the American and the German HE sectors. New American land-grant universities were established to develop on technology and science. The American pragmatic tradition of education was very open to the notion of applying knowledge. The German system was also very sophisticated. It created the dual system in the secondary education sector, where students worked as apprentices for 3 days and then conducted in-class work for 2 days. Within the higher education sector, the influence of Humboldt meant that universities were very open to scientific research. These competing definitions of HE were all posing a challenge to the Oxbridge model. In addition to that, the synthetic revolution in textiles had a major impact on British textile industry, and American and German companies began to compete and win over dominance of British textiles. And so by the end of the 19th century, Britain had lost its lead as the market leader in the textile industry. The second industrial revolution and the desire to theoretically train scientific manpower, the influence from the German and American universities led to the introduction of science and technology to the highly guarded Oxbridge field. The argument was that universities need to do more to develop on science and technology. Now, for a field that was very proud of its autonomy will naturally resist this intrusion. Here you have Cardinal Newman in the mid-19th century when the Oxbridge model was being criticized for not being relevant to a modern society. Here is another quote by a clergyman who felt that any form of orgy should not be taught in a university. University never was and should not be a place where you come to train for a profession. Now, as a side note, though the traditional universities boasted that they do not train individuals to be part of professions, the Oxbridge graduates nearly always took part in some kind of vocation, whether that was administrative, clergyman, lawyer, or a physician. You begin to see in the late 19th century that science and technology is introduced in Oxford and Cambridge, but this was not enough. There was a great demand for more technological innovation, research and training for skilled professionals, which led to the emergence of what became the civic universities, established by the rising industrial class who believed in creating new universities in order to institutionalize the industrial ethos. Originally technical or medical colleges, these new institutions were located within urban centres. The new universities were meant to be all the Oxbridge wasn't. They were originally non-residential, non-denominational, unlike Oxbridge, which were Anglican. These new universities were going to prioritize industry, technology and science, and the students were going to be mainly from the industrial class. Here is a good quote by William White in his book Red Brick. He says, "The pioneers insisted that these institutions be distinct from Oxford and Cambridge, which were considered to be exclusive to the socially elite, where students acquired knowledge that ignored the demands of modern society." So from a theoretical lens, it appears as though the new industrial class were carving out their own educational field, where science and technology would be the central focus and not the liberal arts. Cultural practices in this new field would be distinct from traditional universities. So how does academic drift play out in the civics? Remember, academic drift is the phenomenon we are attempting to understand using Bourdieu's theory. Now, according to theory, once you enter a field, especially one as prestigious as the English HE sector, there will be resistance. If the Oxbridge culture is democratized, it loses its cultural distinction. It loses the value of its cultural capital. Now, to initiate the cultural conflict, all you have to do as an education institute is call yourself a university. The cultural battle is a symbolic battle. Now, because Oxford and Cambridge have high cultural capital, they are the cultural ambassadors, they can dictate the rules of the game. That's the advantage of possessing valued cultural capital. You can legitimate the practices of others. Now, to be a university, the first thing you need to do is gain a royal charter, a royal approval to say you are a university, and only then can you award your own degrees. William White's book really brings this to life. He charts the initial lobbying of University College London and King's College London to gain royal charters. This led to a compromise which became the University of London and the University of London degree, which means UCL and KCL did not receive royal charters initially, but they could award degrees externally through the University of London. Now, the University of London degree is a major development because now for the first time you can gain a degree without going through Oxbridge. You can study at any of these colleges and prepare for the University of London degree exam and gain a degree. This, in terms of cultural struggle, is not good for the value of Oxbridge culture. You can now gain a degree qualification without going through Oxbridge. But the cultural battle does not end there. Because Oxbridge are bearers of high cultural capital, they can also dictate what is a degree. So the London degree exams, as you can imagine, were very academic, based on liberal arts subjects. They had to be. A degree means you have knowledge of the liberal arts according to the Oxbridge model. In my opinion, and according to many, this is where academic drift begins for the civics, because now your benchmarks are not technology and science, but your legitimacy as a university institute and the ability to prepare prospect graduates for an external degree. The civics gained a level of esteem and legitimacy and began to compete on how many students they can prepare for the London degree exam. If you do this, naturally you will give more cultural worth to academia and liberal scholarship and systematically undermine your original aim of being distinct education institutes that focused on science and technology. Now, this was the example of UCL and KCL, who later got their royal charters and the powers to award degrees, and other civic institutes followed suit. But gaining royal charters and awarding degrees was not enough. You are still culturally inferior. You are a new entrant in the field. What made Oxbridge so prestigious was its history, its tradition, its rituals. The new civics had none of that, which means they had to invent tradition, which is a paradox. Tradition, by its very nature, requires a rich history, which pioneering institutes cannot do. You must give things time, and Oxbridge had many centuries of lead on this, which means culturally Oxbridge remained superior. Now, one of the ways to overcome the issue of tradition was to increase student residence. Students can then create societies, participate in extracurricular activities. This created a collegiate environment. There was also the introduction of graduation ceremonies and so on. So that's the general picture of how academic drift happened with the civic. This is by no means an exhaustive account. Much more can be said on the subject. Now, before I continue, I want to just highlight this quote by Bruce Truscott, which was not his real name. Bruce Truscott was an academic in one of the civics. Unlike other faculty members in the civics, he was an Oxbridge graduate. Truscott wrote a scathing critique of the civics, and as you can see, he is critical of the cultural characteristics of the civics, which were, according to Truscott, a cheap imitation of Oxbridge. Truscott's critique was very influential. It created a lot of anxiety about the legitimacy of civic universities. Here is an example close to home. The University of Leeds begins life as the Yorkshire College of Science. When it became an affiliate of Victoria University, which is now the University of Manchester, many of its courses such as mining, textiles, agriculture, leather processing did not gain the honours title, and later these courses that provided the skill demand for the local economy were removed to increase the provision for more degree programs. And when the Yorkshire College of Science gained its Royal Charter, Leeds, like others, changed its name to the University of Leeds. So these are various forms of drift in the early stages of the English HE sector, which in many ways undermined the desire to cultivate skills needed for a technologically developing society. So what's the outcome? By the time we reach the end of the war period, we have major skills shortages in these sectors. The Percy and the Barlow report were two of the main post-war reports on skill deficit and the provision to develop skills. Both reports argued that the HE sector needs to be expanded further. The civics did not produce the skilled technical labour they intended, and the sector as a whole was not meeting demand. It took another 10 years from the Barlow report that we got the government response, which was the establishment of Colleges of Advanced Technology, or CATS. Many of the CATS were former mechanics institutes, the University of Bradford being one of them. These institutes were very much part of the technical college tradition, which was defined by the service ethos, i.e. service to society, developing the skills needed for a technologically advancing society. The CATS were initially administered by the local education authorities, catering for disenfranchised students, non-residential, where teaching was a major function, and they offered many vocational courses like bakery, art, chiropody, part-time and evening courses. The CATS did not award degrees. They awarded the Diploma in Technology, or the DipTech, which was externally awarded by the National Council for Technological Awards. Again, very vocational institutes serving the skill demand for a technologically advancing society. Now, on a structural level, the CATS did not pose a direct threat in terms of entering the university field, as they weren't called universities, nor were they awarding degrees. However, at this stage, the notion of higher education had become synonymous with universities. So even though CATS were not universities, nor did they award the degree, but because they claimed to be higher education institutes, they now had to substantiate that claim. This claim kickstarts the cultural battle. And if HE as a title is synonymous with universities, then by simply being colleges of advanced technology, your legitimacy as a HE institute is compromised. So with the CATS, there was a very active drive to then become universities, and the CATS did what the civics did before them, which is to imitate traditional university practices. On a program level, the NCTA, the National Council for Technological Awards, modelled many of the DipTech courses on the London degree model, which meant that engineers had to study some liberal arts subject, namely the history of engineering. They also had to write academically, do high stakes exams. They had to also do research projects. So you can already see the program drift happening with the DipTech. Burgess and Pratt, in their commentary of the CATS, state that there was always tension between the engineers and the lecturers. This was because the students were technically orientated and they did not grasp the reasons why they were made to do academic work. The lecturers, on the other hand, felt that the liberal education was a way of, and I quote, civilizing the rude mechanics. I think this is very telling of how the desire to have cultural capital amongst staff impacts the student experience. Similar to what happened with the civics, particularly with what we discussed with Leeds University, many of the courses that were deemed unworthy of a HE institute were removed. So things like bakery, art and chiropody, evening and part-time courses were all removed to make way for full-time residential students. Teaching commitments were reduced to allow staff to do research and students to take part in extracurricular activities. Now, one of the key developments for the Cats in the process of academic drift was the removal of local authority control. Cats were now assigned to the University Grants Committee. The reason for that is that the University Grants Committee did not see the Cats as distinct institutions. Rather, they saw the Cats as new universities. And so the University Grants Committee had instigated a number of changes, namely more investment in creating a collegiate environment. By the early 1960s, the Cats were indistinguishable from the universities, and from 1962 to 1964, all the Cats gained their royal charters and became fully fledged universities. Burgess and Pratt mentioned that academics within Cats saw the university status as a positive thing. In retrospect, and with the notion of academic drift in mind, the university status was probably not a good idea. So as with the civics, the outcome of academic drift within the Cats maintained the skill deficit. The Robbins Report of 1963 emphasized this and asked for an expansion of the HE sector. But in order to avoid another academic drift, the Robbins Report advised that the HE sector should be unified. That way, you take away the incentive to seek esteem through imitation. In 1964, the Labour government wins the election. Anthony Crosland becomes the new Secretary of Education. Crosland ignored the recommendations made by the Robbins Report to unify the sector. Instead, Crosland decides to expand by creating a binary HE sector. Crosland was well aware of the previous two attempts to create a rich and cultivated vocational sector, which failed because in both cases the desire to seek esteem led to various forms of academic drift. The binary sector would ensure the division between the autonomous universities and the service-led polytechnics. The universities would continue being funded by the University Grants Committee and conducting research and teaching traditional academic subjects, whilst the polytechnics would serve the local community, be locally administered, receptive to the needs of society. Polytechnics were to be teaching institutions delivering and upholding the technical college tradition and being accessible to disenfranchised students who were local and non-residential. Now, we all know the polytechnics became universities, so there was clearly an academic drift. But how did it happen? Keeping Bourdieu's theory in mind, as it stands, the polytechnic do not pose a threat to the university field. They are clearly distinct institutions with different aims to that of the universities. However, there was the idea that polytechnics were HE institutions, which, as stated before, was a category that was synonymous with the universities. And as with the Cats before, polytechnics began to imitate other HE institutes to achieve legitimacy. But in my opinion, the strongest driving force for the academic drift in the polytechnics was the desire to award degrees. This policy was underpinned by the idea that universities cannot have a monopoly in awarding degrees. It is a qualification that must be democratized, which is a great idea. But as soon as you say that you are awarding a degree, you enter the university field. It is a cultural object that belongs to the universities. They have high cultural capital and they can impose their rules. They can define what a degree is. If you do not accept their definition, then the legitimacy of the qualification as a degree qualification is brought to question. So let's look at the process of creating degree programs in the polytechnics. Firstly, the National Council for Technological Awards, who awarded the DIPTech for the CATs, becomes the Council for National Academic Awards, CNAA. And like its predecessor, the CNAA used the London Degree Framework to approve new degree courses. Now, you may ask, why use the London Degree Framework? Theory tells us you had to. If you want to call your qualification a degree qualification, you must abide by the definitions created by those who have the power to legitimate, which in this case is the London Degree Framework. What does that degree look like? Well, for it to be a degree, it must be broad in scope. It cannot be narrowly defined in terms of occupational protocols. You must ensure students understand various theoretical aspects of the vocation. You must also have a research component. Not being broad, not being theoretical, and not doing research meant that your qualification was too narrow in scope, which would be okay if it was a diploma, but if you want your course to be a degree, it must embody all those aspects. Just as a side note here, the European counterparts to the polytechnics only awarded diplomas. The notion of awarding degrees for vocational subjects is very English. So for a degree, there is a broad scope in terms of learning content. There is also the adoption of university pedagogy, like lectures in order to teach, and there is also the use of summative assessment. The CNAA also pushed and ensured that students had a chance to participate in extracurricular activities. The CNAA also advised on student residence, and slowly but surely various aspects of traditional universities was adopted. John Pratt, in his commentary of the polytechnics, argued that this was due to funding structure and that local education authorities were not as generous in terms of funding the polys. As a result, the polytechnics were imitating universities in order to get equal funding. Now, my own take on this is fine. Let's fund the polytechnics. Let's give them equal funding to the universities. But this still doesn't account for the policy of awarding degrees, which leaves the polytechnics open to the influence of the university field. Academic drift within polytechnics is then a policy failure from the onset. The polytechnics, like the CATs before them, became indistinguishable from traditional universities. The CNAA approved more and more courses, which at the time was seen as a great development. If your course gained degree approval, that meant that you were doing something really good. However, in hindsight, many vocational courses adopted unwarranted academic practices, thus diminishing the ability of the course to develop vocational skills. And so in 1992, as the influence of neoliberal policymaking takes hold, it was deemed sensible to unify the sector underpinned by market principles and let institutions compete for funding from student numbers and from grants. So, to conclude, we began with the definition of academic drift, which is the evolution of vocational systems towards traditional university practices as a way of seeking esteem. We outlined Bourdieu's theory, which examines the drive towards esteem or cultural capital within socially stratified fields. We then discussed the field of higher education, the entrance of vocational institutes within it, starting with the civics, followed by the colleges of advanced technology, and then the polytechnics. We spoke about the ways in which this cultural conflict led to various forms of academic drift. In the next session, academic drift will be used as a theoretical lens and as a way for us to understand the issues of ethnic attainment as ethnic minority students engage in some of the vocational or professional degree programs that have drifted academically.